Alright, for today's critical thought, we're going to be discussing RNG once again, and kind of how little or how much you put into it can greatly determine the impact on the game's design. It's going to be going together for a companion piece over on the site that I've titled The Spice of RNG. Because RNG is like a spice. You put too much in, it can completely wreck a game's design. You put too little in, and nobody will notice it at all. And we've talked about this before, but on the off chance you haven't seen our previous videos or know what we're talking about, RNG refers to random number generation and is a principal component of any game built on abstracted based design or decision making. Basically, whenever you see the words to hit or chance in a game, RNG is a part of that. Now, we can get deeper into this with discussing RNG in the form of loot tables, random or procedural generated design. That's when we start seeing levels or areas that are created through the game itself, but that's going to be a little bit beyond for today. But what I want to focus on again is when you're looking at your game's design, just where and how much should you put RNG in? Because again, when it works, it can greatly extend the life of a game. We've seen this with many RPG-based games. Borderlands, Diablo, even in the tactical side with games like Darkest Dungeon, XCOM, and so on. But again, those games put their RNG into different aspects of the design. And it's important to know when to keep things straight or keep things consistent, and when you want to mix things up or shuffle them with RNG. Now, in a previous video, we've talked about video games do not make use of 100% RNG, as in everything and anything can happen at any time and nobody knows. There's always a set of conditions or rules built into the game's design or an algorithm to determine where RNG will fit and what it will pull from. For instance, with the classic game Spelunky, the RNG is determined, or actually in that case, the procedural generation is determined by what biome or environmental area the player is in. You're not going to see jungle-type enemies and environmental obstacles in the Arctic ruins area, and vice versa. The same goes for loot table design in Diablo, that it picks or pulls from specific verbs or adjectives, that's a better term, for how it will determine loot. That's where we see like the frosty, fire, lightning, hell, darkness, you name it, kind of variety. But the point is, as a designer, it's up to you to determine where you want things to get mixed up, because there is a very wide margin between games that have no RNG versus those that make use of it. And very recently, a great example of this is Into the Breach. This is the latest game from Subset Games, who are most famously known for FTL, a game that features a whole lot of RNG built into what events you get, what items you'll find, and generally how a run works. And again, that's the major allure and defining point of why you put RNG into your game, because it creates chaos and uncertainty. Again, with something like XCOM, the player doesn't always know what's going to happen. You may hit that guy at 70% chance, or you may miss. Same goes for Darkest Dungeon, where every hit is celebrated and every miss or dodge is like a punch to your face. But again, the reason why RNG works is that it keeps things from becoming repetitive or consistent. Gamers are very good at min-maxing, and if they see that a certain combination of items or classes or anything that works predominantly all the time, they're going to make use of that. And this is why RNG is very important, because once players figure out what that best combination is, the entire game is broken after that. Now, getting back to Into the Breach, while the game makes use of turn-based strategy design as its main components, a lot of people, including myself, feel that the game tends to move more towards the puzzle side of things rather than strategic. And the reason, once again, comes down to how little RNG there is. When you're playing Into the Breach, I know exactly how much damage my character is going to do. I know they're going to hit all the time. I know where the enemy's going to move after I hit them, and I always know what the enemy is targeting and how much damage they do. Because of that and the limited number of moves you can make during a turn, this is where that puzzle element comes into play. It's basically saying, I need to beat A, B, and C, but I only have X, Y, and Z available. So how do I make all that work? And because you can't add more tactics or more abilities during play, it keeps things very set. With that said, though, there is a major part of RNG in Into the Breach based on what Vec, or the enemy types, that gets spawned on each turn. You know where they're going to spawn in, you know where they're going to start, but you have no idea what you're going to be facing. And that is a major element of RNG. Because even though the maps are set, what enemies that pop up will greatly affect what tactics they're going to use, what they're going to target, and how you're supposed to deal with them. As a great example of this, one of the Vec enemies is a character who raises the armor on all other enemy units on the field. Now, if your characters can only do 1 point of damage, guess what? They're not going to hurt the enemies anymore until you deal with that. Now, that enemy spawns when, let's say, you have a bunch of 1 hit or 1 life point enemies left on the field. You're in deep trouble. And you don't know what the enemies are going to target in between each round. So it's kind of like a puzzle game where the puzzle pieces are being shifted each time you play it. Now, as we've said a few minutes ago, when it comes to RNG, knowing how much to have into it or how much you want to put in will greatly determine its impact. Switching gears from Into the Breach, Darkest Dungeon features a very heavy RNG based design. Again, I know what classes I'm going to bring in, I know what they can do, but exactly what their impact is going to be each round is all up to RNG. For those of you who watch my Darkest Dungeon plays, you know how much a clutch occultist heal can mean, especially during a boss fight or Darkest Dungeon attempt. Likewise, you know how much it hurts when the boss decides to get a crit on his entire party attacking ability. And that's a major point about RNG, because when it affects your game to that extent, it can have a massive impact on the difficulty and progression curve of your title. Again, when we're playing a game like XCOM, for instance, if I can keep my characters alive and they're getting lucky hits, it means they're going to survive longer, which means they're going to level up or rank up, which gives them more utility and allows them to keep going. But let's say, for instance, I'm playing XCOM 2 and I am wiping every map due to bad luck or bad RNG. That means it's going to be slow for me to progress, and in some cases, I may lose. And that's the tricky aspect of RNG. And we've said this one before. But for every player who has an easy time playing these games, and there are people who have already reported Into the Breach is too easy for them, there are going to be people who are going to have a vastly different experience. They're going to be the ones that every turn the Vex spawn the most annoying or most powerful opposition for them. They're the players who play Darkest Dungeon, and every time the enemy needs a crit, they're going to get it, and then they're going to get a lackluster heal in response. And again, this is why you need to be really careful as to what aspects RNG is going to touch on your design. Again, some games may just use it for level generation or loot generation, which, while that can have an impact, it is nowhere near as powerful as saying everything that the amount of damage you're going to do, if any, is going to be affected by a dice roll. And again, we've talked about another extreme example on our previous talk, Tharsis, the dice pseudo-based board game where you're trying to keep a spaceship alive, where each turn a cataclysmic event happens. In that game, it is 100 million bazillion probability or RNG base. I've had matches where I made all the way to the last possible turn, and it was pretty easy up until that point. And then before I stopped playing, I had a playthrough completely end on the very first turn because I got horrible RNG in terms of those events. Now, what's very interesting, what we haven't talked about yet in this video, is when RNG is in the complete opposite end direction, or I'm sorry, completely opposite end of the spectrum, where it's too little to matter. Because so far, the examples we've talked about have been on the extreme end. But I'm going to ask you folks this. Can you think of games that made use of RNG and it just wasn't enough to be effective? We typically see this in AAA based titles that are trying to add that little extra, again I'm using the word spice for today, to their games. For instance, in titles like Horizon Zero Dawn, Shadow of Mordor, and I assume Shadow of War as well, they make use of gear that can drop or you can find, especially in the Shadow series. But the problem is that the stuff that can impact you is either so small that it doesn't really matter, or it may give you a high number, but it's something that is too conditional or too specific. For instance, when I was playing Shadows of Mordor, I was getting items that are like plus 2% damage. Yeah, that was going to really help me. Or plus 30% chance a York will run away while they're lit on fire. Okay then, that's good for that point. But again, as we were saying with the overall theme for today's video, if it's too negligible, it's like, why even have it? As we said, if RNG could be considered a spice, putting like a single grain of pepper in a pot of soup is not going to do anything. But likewise, if I pour that entire thing in, it's going to ruin that dish. But as I just said, can you think of games where the RNG is too little, that it's just not impacting the game, or it's just not really helping it? Now, like I said at the start, we could easily segue this into talking about procedural and random generation, but that's going to probably be too big for today, and of course we can come back to this, and as we've said before, will be when it comes to RNG. But to wrap things up for today, random number generation is a critical component of any game where you want to throw some chaos into the mix. And as we've said before, the more consistent or repetitive choices are in your game, the less impact or less replayability there's going to be. Because once people start finding the best ways to play, they're going to break your game every time. But knowing where to put RNG in and when to keep things consistent is very important. Because again, if it's too random, not only will it become hard to balance, but it can also make your game unintentionally frustrating to play. And also, as a very last point, you have to be careful when you feature set and random elements. We see this in games that will let you find random gear or random progression, but have set or fixed boss sections or fights. If you're telling me that a boss or a specific encounter requires X, and the game's not spawning X for me, how am I supposed to beat that? That was the major point of contention when we talked about FTL and its final boss versus the entire RNG-based rest of the game. But with that said, thanks for watching today's Critical Thought. If you enjoy things, be sure to come back for daily discussions on game design, and as well as on GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. So until next time, have a great night. Before we get to the credits, just wanted to give a quick thank you and shout out to the supporters over on patreon.com/GWBycer. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. If you'd like to suggest games for me to cover or topics to talk about, let me know in the comments below. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on design, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the Game Wisdom Patreon, you can find us on there on patreon.com/GWBycer. $1 will get you into our private Discord channel where we talk game topics and more. $5 will get you voting privileges for any major event, including the Saturday Night Grab Bag, Patreon-funded goals, and more. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you enjoy more videos here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel.